Life Unscripted podcast with Rosabel, the place where genuine conversations meet inspiring stories, personal growth, and a dash of humor. I'm Rosabel, your host, inviting you to embrace life's unpredictable journey. Celebrate your unique story and find joy in everyday moments. Get comfortable, stay curious, and let's explore together. Unscripted, unapologetic, and unstoppable. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of the Life Unscripted podcast with Rosabel. I'm your host, Rosabel Zohfeld, and today we have a special conversation lined up for you. So imagine stories that pass down through generations, tales filled with courage, danger, and the pursuit of justice. Today's guest, Chris Skates, he has captured those powerful legacies and woven them into an unforgettable work of fiction. Now, Chris is a seasoned novelist. He's a chemist by trade, also a government speechwriter by experience, and above all, he's a master storyteller. His latest novel, Moonshine over Georgia, it is a tribute to the true untold stories of Americans' Prohibition Era. Stories he first heard as a young boy from his own grandfather. Welcome, Chris Skates.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Chris, it's truly an honor to have you here today. And let's begin. Let's talk about that journey from working as a chemist to becoming a novelist. I mean, that is unique. Can you take us back to that moment and perhaps when you realized that storytelling had captured your heart?
Yeah, I actually started writing a little bit of short stories for assignments in high school. And I had a very influential high school English teacher who tried to encourage me to become a writer. But I was really trying to be pragmatic. And I was afraid that if I became a writer, I would end up at a small town newspaper making $10,000 a year. Even though I wasn't really passionate about chemistry, I majored in chemistry when I got to college because I knew I could get a job. But also in college, I had two English professors encourage me to become a writer based on some of my work. So I kept writing. Writing has always been a passion of mine, probably since high school and really middle school is when it started. And so I kept writing a journal, but I didn't show any stories to anybody. And then in 95, my grandfather, the same one who's the main character in this book, passed away. So I wrote a short story about a really important time that he and I spent together. And I printed it out on a printer and took about 25 copies to my family reunion. And everybody in the family just went nuts over it. And they said, you need to be a published author. So I had to learn how to submit to a magazine. This was before the internet. And so I ended up I got a writer in my life that was a mentor to me. And he told me, first thing you've got to do is grow a thick skin because you're going to get rejected about 100 times before somebody actually publishes something you wrote. And that's the only thing he ever told me that was incorrect. The first magazine I submitted that story to published it. And so I got 10 copies of the magazine. They had put some beautiful artwork with the article, 2 pages worth. And then they sent me a $200 check with the magazines, and I had the bug. So from there, I started publishing short stories. Then in 2003, I wanted to try to write a novel, published my first novel in 2005, won an award that year for best historical fiction. And then I've been off and running ever since. I've now written 5 books. Somewhere along the line, I ended up getting an appointment from the governor of Kentucky to be a speechwriter. So I left chemistry and became a full-time writer then, and that's what I've been doing ever since. Wrote a couple of speeches one for the vice president, one for the president. And then I ended up, because of an illness, I ended up come back home to Kentucky for a period of time, but I'm well now. And when I got sick, I decided I have to tell my grandfather's story. So that's when I wrote Moonshine over Georgia.
Now, when you said the president, which president? I'm curious.
President Trump 45.
Awesome.
2020.
Wow.
I wrote one for Vice President Pence, one for President Trump, and I even wrote a tweet for President Trump. Very few people could say they wrote a tweet for President Trump, but I did.
That is awesome. Well, so back to let's talk about your grandfather. So, what was it
Sure.
like hearing your grandfather's first-hand stories? I I bet that was would have been powerful, fun. I mean, I can only
Yeah,
imagine. No,
it was. He was
what?
a great oral
Uh-huh.
storyteller in his own right. And it was an interesting mix because he actually didn't like to brag on himself. He was of that generation that they didn't talk about themselves a lot. So you kind of had to ask him stuff to get him to talking about it. But I knew that from an early age, I learned that he was a revenue agent. He taught me how to hunt and fish. Sometimes we'd be near a stream or something, and he'd say, if you went up this stream about a half a mile, I busted a still there in 1938 or whatever. So that would get him talking about it. So the older I got, the more questions I asked about it. And I spent a tremendous amount of time with my grandfather. I tell people I've probably never been as close to another man as I was with him. We had all the
Wow.
same hobbies, all the same passions. And so I was just in his hip pocket every chance I got. So he actually always lived a couple hours away from me, except for a short period of time where we lived close together. But I would spend summers there, Christmas break, a lot of weekends. And whenever we were hunting, if I could get him talking about the revenue agent days, I would. And
Wow.
he was a very good oral storyteller in his own right.
Now, what was that story that you said, okay, this one I have to write about? Is this one about the moonshine?
Yes. I was staying with him for the summer, him and my grandmother, and we had a little ritual. We would go fishing in the morning, and then he would get me to help him in his garden. He had a huge garden that he fed half the town with. And then we would finish working in the garden. My grandmother would have a huge lunch prepared. And then after lunch, we would watch the Andy Griffith show. So we were watching Andy Griffith, and a character came on that was making moonshine. They were doing a little comedy skit with it where Otis, the town drunk, was trying to buy moonshine from this guy. But my grandfather began to get irritated, and he just kind of slapped the TV off. And I said, Pop, I always called him Pop. I said, Pop, what's wrong? Aren't we going to finish the show? And he said, No, son. He said, it wasn't like that. There was nothing funny about moonshine. And he said, You think you've heard a little child cry? He said, Wait till you take their daddy home. You drug him out of some ditch somewhere. He was sick unto death off a bad moonshine. And you take him home to a little shack, and his children, small children, are running around in the yard in a diaper. They don't have any clothes to wear. They're so poor. And their bellies are distended from hunger. And their daddy just spent their grocery money for the month on a gallon of moonshine. Those little children would hold onto my leg and just wail the most plaintive wail you ever heard. And he said, That's when you've heard a child cry. And that's what the moonshine business did to people.
Wow. So, Moonshine Over Georgia brings the 1940s Western Georgia to life. What was it
Right.
like immersing yourself in the grit, the desperation that you can mention, the resiliency of that era? Tell me more about that.
Yeah. One of the things that I did, it was kind of a cool little writer's trick. My grandfather always made these roll your own cigarettes, and he always lit them with a Zippo lighter. And a Zippo lighter, I should have brought it out, and I didn't think of it, but a Zippo lighter has a really unique sound when you open the metal case, you light it, and then he would always slap it on his leg, close it, and put it back in his pocket. So when I was getting ready to write, I bought a Zippo lighter. They still sell them. And I would open it and light it and close it over and over with my eyes closed in front of my laptop until thoughts of my grandfather started coming back. And then a lot of the stories that you read in the book just came back to me. And the way I describe the whole writing process, and particularly with this book, because it is based on his real cases, is that my grandfather left me with 5,000 pieces of a 15,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. I use living witness interviews and archival research to find the other 5,000 pieces. And then I made 5,000 pieces from fiction. So I use fiction to weave together his real stories along with living witness interviews and archival research. And just the research and the memories of his stories put me in that.
Wow. And that the protagonist is Kid Miller.
Right.
Apparently, well, so he's driven by this fierce sense of honor, right? So
Right.
how much of your grandfather's own character is actually reflected in that kid?
A lot. When I first finished the manuscript, the first draft in 2016, actually, that was the second draft, but the first person I wanted to read it was the closest living witness I knew, which was my mother. My mother is Judy in the story. She's a toddler in the story, but she experienced a lot of this. And so I said, I want her to be the first one to read it. So I sent it to her just on printer paper. And she read the whole thing. And she called me about 2 weeks later and she was sobbing. And she said, Chris, it's not like you wrote a story about my father. It's like you channeled my father. She said, you wrote about conversations that I sat in the room and heard. And it was like you were right there with us. She said, there were things that I didn't even remember that you brought back to me. So she said, I can tell you hung on his every word because I'm just blown away by how accurately you depicted who he was.
Wow. That tells how connected you were with him in
Yeah.
in many ways. And then one of the things I like to know in writing this book, what part of that research that you did surprised you the most? Like, was it something like shocking, inspiring, or just something like you did not expect it at all?
Yeah. So there's a scene in the book, and I won't reveal too much because I don't want to spoil it for your listeners, but where my grandfather gets very physical with a suspect and hits him. And this is a guy that done some really bad things. I was interviewing my mother's brother. So my mom was kind of an accident. She was born, had two much older siblings. She kind of surprised the family. So she had an older brother who was in the Navy in World War II. And so he experienced some of the things that are in my book as an adult, as a grown man, whereas she experienced them as a little girl. So I got to interview him. He was actually 91 when I sat down with him. Of course, I'd known him my whole life, but we had never talked about this. And I don't know why. I wish I had talked to him about it sooner. But we sat down for a couple hours, and he told me that when he was home on leave once, my grandfather said, hey, I need to go question a suspect. I want you to ride with me. But he said, I just wanted to see another person in the car. He said, I don't want you to get out of the car no matter what happens. So my uncle witnessed that fight that you read about in the book, and it went pretty much exactly as I describe it. In fact, there's a point in the fight where my grandfather draws his gun and cocks it and says, it'll be the last step you ever take. Well, that really is a direct quote. I had written part of that scene, but I didn't have it being that physical. So to find out that my fishing buddy and the guy that used to sit me on his knee when I was a little boy would beat a guy up if he was a really bad guy blew my mind. But the more I interviewed people, I found out, and my grandfather said things to me that I didn't fully comprehend at the time, but now I do. He said, when I did the job, if I needed to make a criminal respect the badge, I just did it. In other words, if he had to get physical with a guy, he got physical. And so I was blown away because I never saw that side of my grandfather. He was always so kind and gentle with me that I was like, wow, I can't believe that was. But these guys he was going after were very hard. My grandfather used to have a saying, the old boy had some hard bark on him. These were tough guys. And as one of the moonshiners I interviewed for the book said, we all had guns and we would have shot your grandfather as soon as looked at him. So you had to be proactive and a little bit at times aggressive in order to stay alive.
Right. Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because for what I understand, the world of illegal moonshine was trade was actually brutal. And so I kind of wanted to know, how did you balance showing the violence of that time, but also the humanity of the people who lived it?
Right. Great question. It was much more brutal and violent. We've kind of romanticized it. There's a show called Moonshiners that I actually kind of like it. I find it
Oh yeah,
entertaining.
I am familiar with it, and I watched a little bit of it. Yes.
They make it more comedic and it seems perfectly
Yes.
harmless. And the people that are doing it nowadays, that's probably the case. But these guys were really dependent on the income. Um, in the 40s, especially, organized crime got involved. The mob got involved in the moonshine business. So as the price of moonshine went up astronomically from 1940 to 1949, and as the price of moonshine went up, the violence went up
Wow.
because there was more money to be made, and you had a lot of more unscrupulous people getting into it. There was a time when there were a lot of moonshiners that really did care about the quality of the liquor they were making, and they wanted to make a good product because they were selling it locally. But then when the organized crime got involved, and they even were selling a lot of Georgia moonshine into Al Capone's Chicago, they were selling it to Al Capone. So when you got people like that involved, you got some very unscrupulous moonshiners, some that made toxic moonshine because they didn't know what they were doing and they didn't care. And that's the ones that my grandfather was really focused on, driving them
Wow.
out of business.
Wow. Now, another question I have for you, it's you like you mentioned before, you worked as a speechwriter at the state and national levels, right? So how
Right.
did that experience have shaped your approach to writing dialogue and building authentic characters?
It made me a much better writer. In fact, this book, I first wrote it in 2015 and 2016, and then I became a speechwriter after I finished the manuscript in 2016. So I started trying to get an agent because I wanted an agent to represent me for this book. And I was able to do that. First of all, I don't think the agent would have even taken my call if I wasn't a gubernatorial speechwriter. I think that's what got the door open. But then he took a look at the manuscript. And he's still my agent, by the way. He's a great guy, a lion of the industry. But he sent me an email with just 2 words in it. It said, needs polish. I'm sorry, 2 phrases in it. Needs polish. And then the next one was rewrite and send back to me. And I was really offended. I was like, who does this guy think he is? This is a masterpiece, you know. But what I didn't take into account was I had then been writing speeches for a governor. And when you're a speechwriter, you don't just write speeches, you write official correspondence, you write op-eds for the governor. And it's not that the governor's not a good writer. The governor that I served was an outstanding writer, but they are so busy. They don't have time to write. And there's so many demands that people want them to write stuff. So you write the first draft and then the governor marks it up or whatever. But that is the most intense writer's workshop you can have. And it's pressure and you've got to deliver writing every day. So after 2 years of doing that, when the agent told me needs polish, after I got through pouting for about a week or two, I got the manuscript out, which was at that time just a hard copy. And I looked it over and I was like, my gosh, this guy's right. This thing needs a lot of work. It could be a lot better. So I did a total rewrite in 2019 after having been a speechwriter for all that time. And it's a much better book now because of that. It was just a really intense writer's workshop.
Wow. With that, I want to know what fuels your passion to keep creating and telling new stories?
That is, you said the right word. It is my passion. I tell people when they ask me now, every once in a while you'll get discouraged as a writer. The reason I'm on your show today is I'm trying to help people know that my books exist because 99.9% of the reading public have never heard of me or never heard of any of my books. Amazon, in the meantime, has 9 million titles. So how do I get a reader to find my books in that you're a needle in a stack of needles? So I tell people sometimes when I get discouraged about my sales numbers or whatever that, yeah, I think I'm just going to quit. And that usually lasts about one day. And then I'm back writing again because I can't sing or dance and I ain't very good looking, but I'm a pretty darn good writer. So, if I don't write, what else would I do? I don't know how I function if I didn't write. In addition to my books, I self-published a lot of short stories. I published 4 last year. And so I just love it. I love connecting with readers. Just when I'm getting discouraged, I'll get a Facebook message or maybe a reader found my email and they'll send me an email about how much one of my stories or one of my books touched them. And it just keeps me going. It's really great fuel.
Chris, I don't know how much you know about me, probably not much, but because, but let me just say this. Funny that you mentioned that. That is the reason why I created the podcast because I wrote a book and then I was like, okay, how do I get people to know about my book? And so
Yeah.
as I was, and this started just very like, I'm just gonna do a podcast and my husband want to talk about my book chapter by chapter, kind of share my story. And the next thing I'm getting people like you, authors, or even people that are just telling their own stories. It's amazing.
Yeah.
We need more avenues to connect with the day
Yeah.
to day people.
And Amazon has been a double-edged sword for writers like you and I.
Yes.
We probably wouldn't have as many books out there if it wasn't for self-publishing and Amazon, but everybody's doing it now. So there's a lot more competition. I was very privileged with my first book. I got to go to dinner with an author who had the #1 New York Times bestselling book that week. And I said, how did you do it? Tell me how to do it. And he said something that was back in 2005, and this still resonates with me, and it still holds true. He said, Chris, I've done 100 television shows. I've done around 150 radio shows. I've been featured in over 200 newspapers nationwide, and I still feel like I have to twist every reader's arm to sell every copy. And he said, books have become a very small part of the entertainment pie. Smartphones have killed books because now everybody stares at their phone all day instead of reading a book, which is much better therapy for you.
Yes.
But so books are a small piece of the entertainment pie. And then of that small wedge of pie that is books, Daniel Seal, John Grisham, David Baldacci, and bless his heart, James Patterson, who apparently writes a book every 5 minutes, have 95% of the book market locked up. James Patterson can write a kind of a crappy book, and he's written a few, and it's going to sell 30,000 copies because he's James freaking Patterson. So you and I are fighting over a sliver of a sliver. And podcasting is a great mechanism. I've actually had more success getting my book out there through podcast than any other way. I love book signings. I love meeting face to face with readers. But at a really successful book signing, I might sell 50 books. But on a podcast, you can connect with more people. So it's a great tool, and I'm glad you're doing this.
And I'm just like, this is so much fun having this conversation with you because I'm going to be honest with you. I have a couple book signings myself, and I ditched them just to do this because
Yeah.
I'm having a lot more fun getting to know people, learning. I mean, it's been an incredible journey. Every time out there, like I said, and then helping other authors, to
Yeah.
expose, and not just authors, people that have, like, let's say they're selling courses or whatever, and creating a community. That's also what's important.
Yeah.
And then I was also going to mention to you audiobooks. Do you have an audiobook?
On this one, on Moonshine Over Georgia, I did my first audiobook, and now I want to do one for every book. The audiobook creation was one of the most rewarding creative experiences of my life, even as much as I love writing. I first started recording my grandfather's character myself, and I did okay, but I don't know, I didn't feel comfortable. I felt really nervous. I don't feel nervous at all talking to you. I've made speeches to big audiences in politics. That doesn't bother me at all. For some reason, trying to talk into that microphone and be my grandfather really freaked me out. So I met a voice actor actually on Twitter, Gary Barboza, and we connected, and he wanted me to do it myself. He wanted to coach me. He said, it's your grandfather. You should be the one to do this. And I just never could get comfortable. So he said, I'll tell you what, you do the first 2 chapters. I'll do the first 2 chapters for free, and then you can compare them. And he absolutely crushed me. He's just so good at what he does. He sounded so much better, and I liked his presentation so much better. So I talked him into doing it for me, and he was very reasonable on the price because it was his first audiobook. He usually did commercials. That was his normal way of making a living. But here's what was amazing. When he finished the whole audiobook, and we did a chapter at a time, and I was like the director and the producer. So sometimes he would do a character, and I'll be like, no, that's not what I meant at all. And we would work it out, and he was real good about redoing it. But when he finished the whole thing, I listened to it in its entirety. Listening to a professional actor bring characters that I created to life was one of the most rewarding creative experiences I've ever had. And here's another thing that I didn't expect. I've now listened to the audiobook 6 times. I felt like I was in the vehicle with my grandfather. I felt that connection. And then the other thing that it brought out to me is I heard things that, even though I wrote them, a lot of times I could remember where I was sitting when I came up with that line, where I wrote it, but it didn't resonate with me personally the way it did when I heard his voice. So hearing the audiobook made me realize that, yes, the book was about a famous Georgia murder case. Yes, it was about my grandfather. Yes, it was about good versus evil, but it was also about me and my own inner struggles and my own conflict sometimes. Some days I feel like the best guy in the world, and some days I feel like the biggest jerk in the world. And I didn't see as much of myself in the book until I heard another person do the audiobook.
Well, and let me ask you this because this is very much, I'm I'm coming with all these questions, author to author question here.
Yeah.
This is something that happened to me. So here's a little like, if you can see what my book looks like. It's called The
Yeah.
Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream, right? And so I don't know why I printed the first copy, right, and I read it entirely. It's just 100 pages. I read it
Okay.
again. I read it again, and one day it was a Sunday. I read it, and I had the most. I had this. I'm not gonna call it weird, but I had this very interesting feeling like, okay, this is my book, but it's inspiring me. I'm like, am I just being like, is this because I wrote it, or is it because it's truly? I was like, you know what I mean? And kind of like
Yeah.
what you were
Yeah.
mentioning, and like, so I wasn't sure. Is it because I wrote it, or is it because it's truly inspiring? It's that.
I think the writing, I got a theory on that. I think the writing process, when you're a writer and a storyteller at heart, you get in touch with some of the deepest recesses of your heart and of your subconscious. So sometimes things end up on the page that wasn't your intention at the time, but then like what you're describing and what I describe with the audiobook, you recognize it later through your readers. Um, a lot of it I recognize through the audiobook, but also people have approached me at book signings that already have read the book and will tell me stuff that just a lot of them are very emotional and they're crying when they talk to me. And you're like, wow, I didn't realize this would mean that to that person, but I see it now. I see it when they're saying it. And there's still passages that I'll come across either in the audiobook or if I'm just glancing through it or something that I'm like, damn, that was a good sentence. I really
Yes.
crushed that one, you know. And every once in a while there'll be something that I'll be like, oh, I could have done that better. I wish I'd said that different. But
Hmm.
that I don't really have much of that, especially with this book. This book is pretty much the way I would want it,
Yes.
uh, as as it is. One thing that for some of your listeners that may be new writers, one thing that I told my speechwriting interns and other people that have asked me to help them with writing a book, one thing that people fail to do is rewrites. Every writer should accept the fact right this second, me and you included, that your first draft stinks. Writers tend to fall in love with our own words. So we might write a first draft and we're like, man, I already nailed it. But Ernest Hemingway said, put your writing in a drawer and close it and let it rest for 2 or 3 days. Then get it back out and reread it. And you'll find this needs to be rewritten. This needs a lot more. I can do it a lot better. I can conserve a lot of words. I can make it tighter. So if the first writer that I really got to be friends with, who was a huge mentor to me when I first started in 99, he said, writers write. He said, there's people that say they want to be a writer, and then there's people that really want to work at the craft of being a writer. And so if you're a writer, you'll rewrite and
Yes.
you'll look at it as a craft, like a bricklayer trying to make a really strong
Yes.
wall.
And I have to make a confession here because nobody, I mean, I wrote a book, I rewrote it, I published it, and a month later, I'm like, nope, back out
Yeah.
and redid it and republished. And it cost me. It cost me to do it, but I was willing to pay the price because, like you say, because you're looking for quality, you're looking to give your best. Because for the longest time, and that's what I kept writing the book and kept writing the book, it's like it's missing something. That's it, like a really closing chapter that goes with the title and the whole thing. Okay, I got it. And I did it, and I feel so much better now. Like I
Yeah.
can literally sleep at night because, okay, kind of like what you're saying, you feel good.
Yeah. And
You
good
feel
for
good
you
about
for
it.
kudos to you for doing that too. And I've actually got a book out there on Amazon right now. It's my first collection of short stories. I would call it a memoir, but it's not really completely chronological. It's more just a book of essays about my life and some things that I've overcome because I wrote it to encourage other people. But I saw something in it just the other day and I was like, I cannot believe I put that out there. I did not realize that was worded that way. So I'm actually going to be resubmitting that uh, just for that one paragraph.
Yeah,
The really
absolutely.
stinky paragraph.
Also, I'm gonna tell you something. I don't mind telling people my age. I'm 42 years old, right? And so, interestingly, I mentioned to someone, I didn't even people get to know, and people, and so I was actually at my regular job, and somebody said, "Hey, you're a published author now. Congratulations!" And then somebody asked, "What is that book about?" I said, and I didn't know at the time. It was so weird because I didn't know what to say, you know. So I said, "Well, it's
Yeah.
a memoir." And they looked at me and I said, "Aren't you too young to write a memoir?" And I'm like, "Says who?" You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Says who? And that says who has stuck with me because I had a guest here on my podcast that he has done so many wonderful things with his life. And one of his things was says who. And says who has gotten him in places that, I mean, he's been on TV, he's done, and I'm like, that's my favorite. Says who, you know, the
Yeah.
sky isn't the limit, you know, you can go
Right. Right.
beyond that. So,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I left a 30-year chemistry career at 53 to go serve for a governor and took a pay cut to do so. But I went places and experienced things that I never would have dreamed were possible because I was willing to make that jump. And I talk about being out of your comfort zone. I went from a chemist supervising a lab to writing for a governor. And a lot of times my writing was going in a lot of newspapers, and you had a lot of people scrutinizing what you were saying. So yeah, says who. I like that.
Wow. That is the yes. And so let's talk about historical fiction. I believe it requires a very delicate balance, right? Between what's fact and what's imagination, right? And
Yeah.
so how do you approach that dance between honoring the history, because you have to do that, right? And then also crafting an emotionally gripping story.
Did I already use the jigsaw puzzle analogy? I don't remember if I said that
No,
already or
I
not.
don't think so. Yeah.
This story in particular, but really, my first book is also historical fiction. It's about Noah and the Ark. Didn't get to interview any living witnesses for that one, but uh, on this book, I've learned to describe it this way. My grandfather left me with 5,000 pieces of a 15,000 piece jigsaw puzzle.
Okay.
I used archival research and living witness interviews to find the other 5,000 pieces of the 15,000. Now I had 10. So then I used fiction for the last 5. And fiction allows me to get into the heart of people. Like my grandfather told me about a conversation that was really pivotal to the case that he had with a truck stop cook who witnessed the murder. And it was just a one-on-one conversation. And in that conversation, he told my grandfather something that he only told my grandfather, and it became a big, big deal in the trial. But that's all I knew. I knew the key piece of the information that he gave my grandfather. I knew that both of them were very emotional because a murder had just taken place at that scene an hour before, but I didn't know what was said. I didn't know the words. So that was where fiction came in. And I went to a lot of these locations when I was writing to just get into the right frame of mind. But I just wanted to think to myself, okay, these were two men from the 1940s. They had not seen violence on their television. They didn't have televisions, for one thing, but they didn't see violence in their movies and their television. They weren't desensitized to it. So what would their emotions be an hour after this murder occurred? And that's how I crafted the conversation, a fictional conversation. But everybody that's read the book tells me they can't tell where the fiction starts and the history stops. And that was exactly what I tried to do. I tried to make it to feather it in so smooth that you wouldn't be able to tell. And as my mom said, you channeled my father. And I think I channeled a lot of other people that lived during that time. I just did a book event in Georgia in the town where the murder trial took place. This is a huge part of local history. They even have some of those green steel historical markers around the town just about this trial in this case. And I had a 92-year-old man come, and he said, "Son, I'm 92 years old. When I was a boy, I sat up in the balcony of this courtroom and I watched your grandfather's testimony. And it inspired me to become an attorney. And then I was a judge in this very courtroom for 20 years until I retired." The courtroom, it's just a historic site now. It's not a courtroom anymore. But that just gave me chill bumps. And he said, "I cannot wait to read your book." And I've had many people that are older that either their parents experienced the case or they experienced it as a child, and they've contacted me and said, "You absolutely captured it." And so that lets me know that my methodology was correct.
That's awesome. That's really inspiring, the story. Wow.
Thank you.
And I know, so you mentioned that you have a nonfiction collection, right? That's
Right.
coming up soon. Can you give us a little sneak peek of what the readers can expect?
Yeah, it's called Showdown at the Beanstalk. And that is about a third of the stories are humor stories. And so that is the first humor story in the book. It's about when I was 5 years old and I loved playing cowboys all the time. And I had my little 6-shooter and my stick horse. And somehow I got it in my 5-year old brain that the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk had snuck onto the little farm where I lived. So I went after the giant from Jack and the Beanstalk with my 6-shooter. And that's what the first humor story is about. Um, but what readers can expect is I had to overcome things in my life. A lot of people do. I'm not whining, I'm not complaining, but I had some abuse in my childhood. I moved 43 times. I was constantly the new kid at school. And then as an adult, I mentioned that I wrote a speech for President Trump. The reason I didn't write any more speeches for him is because I got cancer. I collapsed one day on my way home from work, and there I am 900 miles away from my Kentucky home. I'd only been in Washington, D.C. 2 months, and suddenly I'm in the hospital being told I have acute lymphoblastic leukemia.
Oh,
And
wow.
after a couple of weeks of further testing, I found out it wasn't just any leukemia; it was the most deadly leukemia in the world. And they ended up having to be transferred to Baltimore to Johns Hopkins because only that doctor had ever cured it, and he had only cured it one other time. I'm now his second, but he told me I had only a 2% chance to survive, and I have survived. I am now fully cured. It was a brutal battle. I lost 95 pounds, but so that battle with cancer and some of what I overcame as a child, I write about not in any kind of a woe is me way, but in a way that lets the reader know whatever you're going through, you're going to make it. You're going to survive. You're going to thrive. I did it. You can too. So that's really what it is mostly about. And then some humor stories thrown in just to lighten it up a little bit.
Wow. That's incredible. Is there anything I have not asked you that perhaps you say, okay, I gotta get this out, I gotta say this?
I'll tell you quickly about two of the people that were my living witness. Two of my living witness interviews. I was able to find. So when I was writing this book, I didn't want it to just be about the murder that happened in Coweta County because that had already been made into a movie in the 90s. Even though I had brand new information about it, I didn't want to just tell that case. I wanted another case too. So I looked through my grandfather's papers, and my grandfather kept this box with his law enforcement papers in it, and I found this, which is you won't be able to read it, but it's a commendation from the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. You can see the letterhead there.
Yes.
And it said, "This is to commend you for rounding up and aiding in the conviction of the Upson County Liquor Gang." And I was like, okay, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard of in my life. And he had never told me about the Upson County Liquor Gang.
Wow.
So I started digging into it. And I found the last surviving member of the Upson County Liquor Gang in a nursing home in Panama City Beach, Florida. And I spent 3 of the most fascinating hours of my life with this old gentleman. His mind was completely clear. He had some medical problems, but his mind was as clear as mine and yours. And he told me, he said, "Son, I want to tell you this about your grandfather." He said, "I served in World War II, but your grandfather was the only man I ever encountered that I would call fearless." He said, "You got to understand, our stills were miles away from the nearest road. We all had a gun, and we would have shot your grandpa as soon as looked at him. But he was fearless and relentless, and he pretty well shut down the liquor business in the western part of Georgia." So to hear that from a guy that my grandfather had put in jail back in the 40s, just it still gives me chill bumps telling you now that was my grandfather's level of commitment. And just to speak to those living witnesses, I also was able to interview a revenue agent that my grandfather trained. He was 86 years old when I talked to him. Just some great stories, some great new information about my grandfather. And I found out that my grandfather was the man that I thought he was, a man of honor and a man of fairness, but a man that was tough as nails and relentless.
Wow. Amazing. Incredible story.
Thank you.
So I want you to tell our listeners where they can find you online. Where can they get in touch with you?
The best place, I am on Facebook and Twitter, and I do get reader messages on Facebook Messenger and tweets. But as far as my books, the best way to find me is just go to Amazon.com and type in Chris Gates author, and you'll see my books there. I'm about to re-release a novel that's been temporarily out of print, which is one of my favorite stories I've ever written. It's a political thriller about a young woman that discovers a terror plot and stops it from happening. And so you'll see 5 books there. You'll see Moonshine Over Georgia. Moonshine Over Georgia you can get on Amazon in audio, print, or Kindle, whatever you prefer. And that's the best way to support me and support my writing. And then just reach out to me on Facebook. I'm easy to find.
Awesome. Chris, thank you so much for bringing us into your world today.
Thank you.
I mean, your passion is for storytelling. I mean, your respect for story, your deep family legacy shine through every word that you speak here, and then
Thank
you
you.
write. I'm thinking. And then for those of you listening, please get in touch with Chris. I mean, this would be amazing. Also, if you want to step back in time, this is what I will say, to feel the grit, the tension, and the heart of Americans' Prohibition era in the South, you need to pick up Moonshine Over Georgia by Chris Gates. You can find it again on Amazon, just where you can find my book as well. So connect with Chris, like he says, on Facebook. And of course, I love for you to stay connected with the Life Unscripted podcast so you don't miss any of our episodes. And then you can go to rosabelunscripted.com where you can find all the social media links to follow me as well. Send me a message, and thank you for being part of our community where every life story is unscripted and every conversation matters. So until next time, stay curious, stay unscripted. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to invite you, yes, you listening right now, to check out my book, The Courage to Succeed at True American Dream. It is available now on Amazon and also Barnes & Noble. This is a story of resilience, grit, and what it really means to chase your dreams, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you ever face fear, failure, or uncertainty, this book will meet you right there and remind you that courage always has a voice. Just search The Courage to Succeed at True American Dream by Rosabel Zohfeld on Amazon, or head to the link in the show notes, because your dream is worth it and your courage can take you there.